Welcome, everyone, to the Talking Animals Law and Philosophy series. This is our first event in Lent term, which is the first term in the new year here in Cambridge. My name is Raphael Fazol. I am an assistant professor in public law at the Cambridge Law Faculty and the co-director of the Cambridge Centre for Animal Rights Law. This is the 10-year anniversary of the Talking Animals series, and we've got some really amazing speakers this year for you. And today in particular, I'm really excited to have two brilliant speakers who are going to talk to us about their new book. But before I introduce them, I'd like to say a few words about the format for those of you who may be joining us for the first time. We will listen to a presentation shortly given by our presenters that will last somewhere between 30 and 45 minutes. And then we'll have time for Q&A. And that will last somewhere between 30 to 45 minutes, depending on the presentation. The event will end at 6:30 p.m. UK time, but I appreciate people are joining from other time zones as well. So we go for roughly 90 minutes. The Q&A very much allows you to come in with any questions and comments you have for our speakers. If you would like to participate, please use the Q&A box. And if you're on a desktop computer, you can find that box on the bottom of your Zoom app. You can type in your question, your comment there. You can also upvote other people's comments if you like one in particular and like to see that one answered. And equally, you can comment on other people's contributions as well. The event is also being recorded, so if you need to leave early or if you'd like to send the link to a friend, we will upload the video to YouTube and our website in due course. Now, I think that's everything I had to say as far as the format of the event, and it is now my great pleasure to introduce our speakers. We've got Sue Donaldson and Will Kymlicka joining us today. Sue Donaldson is Research Associate in Philosophy at Queen's University at Kingston in Canada. Her research is situated in the political turn in animal rights theory. So that means she explores the implications of recognition of animals as members of social, cultural, and political communities. As I'm sure many of you will know, she co-authored with Will the now famous classic Zoopolis, A Political Theory of Animal Rights, which came out in 2011. And she's published over 40 academic articles as well. Will Kymlicka is Canada Research Chair in Political Philosophy, also at Queen's University at Kingston. He has published 8 books and over 200 articles, which have been translated into 32 languages, and he's received many awards as well. His books include Contemporary Political Philosophy, Multicultural Citizenship, Multicultural Odysseys, and of course, Zoopolis. But most important for our purposes today, both of them now have a new book on their impressive list of publications, and that book is called Animals and the Right to Politics, and it came out with OUP this year. And we're really excited to have the two of us talk to us today about their new book in this book launch. So I'd like to now hand over to Will and Sue to talk to us about the book. Thank you very much for being here.
Right. Thank you, Raphael, for that very kind introduction and for the invitation. We're delighted to be here and to have a chance to talk about our new book. So we're just going to now share the screen. We've got a PowerPoint presentation. So we won't have a chance to summarize all of the arguments or chapters in the book, but I did want to focus on the core idea, which is this idea of a right to politics. So basically what we want to do is explain what we mean by a right to politics and why we think it's important for animals to have it. So just by way of context, this book is part of what's called the political turn in animal ethics. And the core idea behind the political turn is that we need to shift our focus from moral status to political status. So if we go back 30 or 40 or even 50 years, many people in animal ethics thought that the crucial task we faced was to expand the moral circle. This was a metaphor that Peter Singer made famous. We need to expand the moral circle to get people to acknowledge that animals have moral standing or moral status. And if we think about it, there's been quite a bit of success in that task. The evidence suggests that the overwhelming majority of people agree that animals have moral status. But that change in people's individual beliefs about moral status have not yet, in any event, had any real impact on the actual treatment of animals. We continue to oppress and exploit and harm animals on a massive scale. Wild animals are just disappearing off the planet. Domesticated animals are subject to ever more exploitative and confining treatment. So, how do we explain this puzzle? That the moral circle has expanded, but the actual treatment remains oppressive. For people in the political turn, the answer is that animals have not yet gotten into the political circle. Animals do not have any political standing or political status, and as a result, political decisions remain resolutely anthropocentric. There's no mechanism to ensure that political decisions track the interests of animals or are responsive to their interests. And so the shared question that everyone in the political turn asks is, how do we get animals into politics? And so there's now actually a lot of different models out there. A lot of people are working in this field. And we draw in developing our own approach, we draw on several of the models that are out there. We actually quite kind of shamelessly take bits and pieces from various of our colleagues who work in this field. But we also use the book to express some reservations about the limit of some of those alternative approaches. And so for today's presentation, let me just focus on one example, which I think it's the most common model that's in the political turn literature. And it basically says that the way to get animals into the political circle is through some form of surrogate representation. So the basic logic here is that we should think of animals as one example of a much more general problem in democratic theory about how to ensure the interests are represented of people who are not themselves political agents. So on this view, animals should be viewed as political patients, not political agents. But there are other political patients on this view, for example, young children or people with severe cognitive disability or future generations. These are all seen as examples of groups who are affected by political decisions, but are assumed not to be able to speak on their own behalf. And so in all of these cases, what we need to do is to appoint or elect someone to speak on their behalf. And one form this could take is, for example, appointing an ombudsperson to speak on behalf of animals. That's a model that's been used in the case of children in many countries. There's an ombudsperson in the legislature to speak on behalf of children. Or we might more ambitiously think about appointing members of parliament. You might say set aside 5 seats in the national legislature for people whose task it would be to speak on behalf of animals. So this is the idea of surrogate representation for those who are seen as incapable of political agency, political patients. And so we call that politics on behalf of animals. On our view, that model has a role to play. There will inevitably be a need for humans in some times and places to speak on behalf of animals. But we don't think it's the only way to include animals in politics, and that if it is viewed as the only way, it can quickly lead to problems and have perverse effects. So in the book, we discuss several potential problems with this model, but let me just focus on 2. The first is that thinking about animals just as political patients reproduces a very widespread stereotype that animals are basically incompetent. So we call this the minimal animal. It's a term we take from Dominique Listel. So on this stereotype, animals are seen as capable of suffering, which is why we need to take their interests into account, but they're not really seen as capable of anything else. They're not seen as capable of making decisions on their own, individually or collectively. They're not seen as capable of learning. They're not seen as capable of engaging in any interesting form of negotiation or cooperation. So that's the minimal animal, and many of the existing models of surrogate representation just reproduce that very narrow stereotype of animals, and we want to get beyond that. A second problem, it's related, is that this model just takes as a given, as a kind of unquestioned starting point, that humans have the right to govern animals. Of course, the goal of these models is to govern better, to govern in a way that's more responsive to the interests. But it just takes as given that humans have sovereignty over animals. And in our view, that's something that needs to be explained and defended rather than just taken as a given. And that in fact, it's quite dangerous to just start from the assumption that humans have sovereignty over animals. Dinesh Wadiwal, amongst others, has argued that this is where things go wrong in human attitudes towards animals, is precisely that first premise of human sovereignty over animals. So in our model, we want to start from a different starting point. And here's one way to think about our alternative starting point for how to get animals into politics. The first point is that we should think about animals not just as individuals or as members of species, which is the way animals are typically thought of, but first and foremost as belonging to social groups, herds, pods, flocks, and others. And that in these social groups, animals are competent actors. We should start from the presumption, it's the defeasible presumption, but we should start from the assumption that they're competent to make decisions for themselves, individually and collectively. And as such, they have rights to self-rule and shared rule, which is what we mean by a right to politics. And this means that the political inclusion of animals is not just about having politics on behalf of animals, but we also need to make room for politics by animals, the kind of politics that animals themselves do on their own, but also politics with animals, humans doing politics together with animals. So basically what we want to do in this talk is first explain what do we mean by politics, explain why we think that animals engage in politics in the relevant sense, explain why we think this grounds a right to politics, and then consider some implications. So first, what do we mean by politics? So some of the people who defend the idea that animals engage in politics, they justify that claim by adopting a very, very broad definition of politics in which virtually everything is always already politics. I think you can see this in some forms of the post-humanist or new materialist literature. So according to Jane Bennett, for example, if the wind blows through the trees, that's the wind and the trees are exercising political agency because everything is always political agency. So that's not the definition we use. We in fact start from, I think, a very standard definition of politics. If you take virtually any introductory textbook in political science or political theory, it'll begin with the idea that politics is, in the first instance, a vehicle by which the members of social groups navigate the challenges of group life. How do they negotiate? I mean, we live in these interdependent social groups, but we need to navigate disagreements. We need to come up with some rules about cooperation. We need to address the challenges of group life, decide how to share benefits and burdens, and so on. So first of all, politics is about navigating the challenges of group life. It's also standardly argued, and we agree, that politics is cultural. Politics is something one learns to engage in. So wherever politics exists, there's always some form of political socialization by which the members of a group learn how politics is done around here, which could be learning from adult to child or from peer to peer. And then thirdly, it's part of the standard definition of politics that it's open-ended, that there's always scope for something new to emerge, what Hannah Arendt called natality. Politics always has the possibility that there will be innovation, that it's always unpredictable, it's open-ended, and this is in part because politics is never just a formula for aggregating or um, counting pre-existing identities and interests. It's also a form, an activity by which people's interests develop, how by their identities develop. They learn about who they are, they learn about who other members are, they learn about the nature of the groups they belong to, and politics is transformative of people's subjectivity. Okay, so these are all standard parts of a definition of politics, and we share that this is what politics means. But there are some ways of navigating the challenges of group life that are not really normatively desirable or even permissible. So you might imagine that in some groups, the challenges of group life are being managed or addressed through war, through violence, through slavery, through extermination. Um, on some definitions, all of those are forms of politics. You remember the famous Clausewitz phrase that war is politics by other means. But in the tradition that we come from, politics is different from war and violence and tyranny and slavery and extermination. Politics emerges when the members of a group make a commitment to resolve their differences peacefully. Politics emerges when people are disposed to resolving the challenges of group life through peaceful negotiation, not war and violence. And that means that whenever politics emerges, it is already a normative achievement. That where politics exists, that means that the members of a group have avoided the risk of resolving their differences through war and violence. So politics is always a normative achievement. And for politics to be possible, it both presupposes and helps to nurture a number of normatively desirable, valuable pro-social traits. You can only have politics where there's some baseline pro-social emotions, forms of caring and empathy, capacities for cooperation, capacities for norm responsiveness. So these are normatively desirable emotions, dispositions that are part and parcel of politics, understood as an alternative to war and violence. And where we have politics in this normatively robust sense, politics is experienced by the members of the group not again as tyranny or as alien rule, but as something that they recognize as a form of what we do. This is how politics we do around here, and people in some form or other buy into politics. They identify with the political process and feel that they are in some sense part of it. Okay, so that's a normatively robust conception of politics. And now the question is, do animals engage in it? And I'll turn that over to Sue.
Yes, so how does this relate to animal groups, animal behavior, this normative conception of politics? And how do we defend our position that many animals, maybe not all animals, but many animals do indeed engage in politics as a social, cultural, and open-ended process, and one that constitutes a meaningful normative achievement. So we're going to start again. This is slightly repetitive, but just to reinforce these sort of presumptions about the nature of social and political life. So politics as a socio-cultural practice. So all political animals on our account belong to social groups. Now those can be mixed species groups or single species groups. So we see that in the wild, but also in places like sanctuaries for formerly farmed animals where multi-species kind of community have emerged. And politics is about how such groups navigate the challenges of collective life, as Will said. And we might think particularly about the fact that it's individuals in society together, right? So there's always navigation of different heterogeneous individual interests and within the context of a group where they realize their potential and flourishing. And so, as Will said, this presupposes that social animals come into the world with some orientation to group life. So we have certain pro-social impulses or inclinations that, and we are inclined and desiring of interacting with others and of being part of group life. But this, of course, brings challenges of integration, of coordination. So individuals, of course, have their own personalities. They can have conflicting interests, different preferences, and so on. So there are various domains of social and cultural practice that are relevant for how animals navigate politics as a normative process. And so I'm going to consider some of the key ones. Starting with social learning. So as Will noted, we now know a great deal of animal behavior is socially learned from parents, other adults, and peers. It's not scripted by genes. It's not just instinct. It's not just about environmental triggers or environmental conditioning. And so social animals need to be socialized or acculturated into the norms and roles and practices and cooperative activities of their group. So that might be group hunting or engaging in group self-defense, learning how to be a good parent. It might be just the daily rules of interaction, how you greet one another, how you play together, and so on. So here we have a young lion cub who has not yet learned the norms of adult lion society, that you don't climb on other people's heads. But at the same time, we have an adult who has learned a norm about how you tolerate infants, right? You don't have an expectation that infants know already that they're not supposed to climb on your head. And so adults tolerate young in many animal societies, as they do newcomers who come into the group, say as adolescents. There's recognition that they need time to get up to speed with the norms of the community. And as we said, this presupposes that individuals are oriented to the group, right? That they have some desire to figure out what the rules are around here. And this kind of socialization and acculturation allows societies to achieve certain kinds of stability, predictability, and coordination of their interaction that can underlie, say, cooperation. Okay, so that's social learning. But again, socialization and acculturation sort of help everybody be singing from the same song sheet, as it were. But it is a society of individuals whose behavior is open, not fixed, who have different personalities, different needs and desires. And so here is where, for example, language comes in. Again, we're now learning that there's so much more animal language happening in so many ways that we didn't formally recognize. So it's not just that vocalizations and body language are far richer and more subtle than we understood, but animals are engaging in infrasonic communication, echolocutions, like click languages, electromagnetic communications, sense, of course, leaving tracks and traces in the environment, all kinds of ways that animals are engaged in this important matter of sharing information with one another that is going to be relevant to how they coordinate and make decisions as a group. And then there's also, when it comes to decision making, all kinds of activity directed towards how those decisions get made. And again, we see a lot of diversity, obviously, and many animal groups use multiple modes of making decisions. This photo is of the African wild dogs, who are famously the ones who sneeze to leave. So if an individual or small group want to go off on a hunt or go to the water hole or whatever, they emit this, make this sneezing kind of vocalization. And if enough others in the group also make the sound and quorum is achieved, then the group has made a decision and acts on that decision. So many versions of that in different kinds of animal societies. And then there's also great variety in leadership structures. So we tend to think that leadership is a bit of a pyramid. There's, animal societies, there's a leader at the top, and all the decision making goes down from that leader. And what we're actually seeing in the ethological research is much more distributed kinds of authority and leadership in animal societies. So this is often domain specific. So for example, if you think of a herd of wild horses, if they're under threat from a predator, it's the lead stallion who's going to be making the decisions for the group. But if it's about finding forage or a place to bed down for the night, many other aspects of life, it will be a lead mare or a group of lead mares who are making the decisions. So there can be, and we see this in many ways, that there's kind of a division of labor that disperses authority. And authority might look more hierarchical when there's something really crucial at stake, like predator threat, but also things that might be very conflictual around sex or food sharing, but that there are many other aspects of day-to-day life that are often the group decisions are made in a much more horizontal way, ground up way. Different members of the group can propose suggestions for what the group will be doing next, and those might or might not be taken up. So lots of variety here. But the main thing is that animal societies have developed all these complex ways of communicating information and preferences and coming to decisions as a group. And next, so even though we might have everyone kind of singing from the same song sheet and lots of rules and norms about how decisions get made, there is always going to be conflict. There's always going to be potentially irreconcilable differences. And so animal groups have also developed many ways of managing or mitigating frustrations. And some of these are preemptive. So we see lots of different variations on kind of fission fusion processes in animal societies. So this is where large groups break down into small groups to go off and then come back together later. So thinking again about that wild horse society, it will include some subset of mares who are either lactating or pregnant. They need more food and water than the other horses. So on any given day where the bulk of the group might just want to rest or play or whatever, the mares will take themselves off, go foraging and come back and meet with the group later. And so in this way, everybody's needs and desires can be met using fission fusion rather than making a decision where some part of the group loses out. And fission fusion works not just on that kind of daily basis that we often see in lots of herd animals. It can operate on a seasonal basis as well. So if you think about elephant family groups who, when food and water are abundant, will travel long distances to meet up with the rest of their clan on an annual or semi-annual basis. And because that's an opportunity to socialize, to find mates, to care collectively for their young and so on. But then when the drought season hits, then the smaller elephant family group will break off again and go to where the matriarch knows of a water hole that will get them through the dry season, and so on. So that kind of fission fusion process, I think, can be looked at as one of the ways that animal societies try to get the most benefit out of group society while distributing the benefits, the burdens of doing so. Another common practice, of course, are kinds of reconciliation. So these are more after the fact. So there's been a fight or somebody's disgruntled, and many animal societies engage in things like grooming or providing food or play or sex as a way of bringing disgruntled members back into the group and reaffirming sort of group solidarity. Okay, so far we've looked at all of these ways that animal societies have of coordinating, communicating, making decisions together, ensuring everybody is able to cooperate. But what about the normative or the buy-in part of this story. So as Will said, you could have a society that achieves cooperation, but that's just through sheer tyranny. Um, and so it's part of the story, of course, that these animals are using all these strategies for achieving peace and stability and cooperation versus violence and chaos. But what about the legitimacy question? So is there a sense in which animals agree to or have a say in self-government? Are they willing and desiring participants in group practices, or are they simply coerced? And is there room for dissent and change? And do they identify with the group and benefit from feelings of belonging? So I'm just going to touch very quickly on each of those. So as I said earlier, social animals come into the world primed for belonging, primed to orient themselves to the social group and desire to be part of a social group. But there's also a lot of interesting research in animal leadership. And I know I spoke a moment ago about leadership, about horizontal leadership and dispersion of authority and so on. But some of this research is specifically considering the difference between sort of like rule by bullies, so leaders and domination hierarchies, where subordinates are compelled or feel under threat, coerced to follow, as distinct from leadership, where subordinates aren't compelled, but they are willingly following leaders. And so there's quite a bit of research about this and interesting ways of getting at this. But it's become clear that in many animal societies that individuals in the group turn to their leaders. They know that they have valuable knowledge or experience, like about where that water hole is in drought season, and they trust them to act in the interests of the group. And so a lot of behavior is a willing participation, not just in the norms, but in following leaders, and not just compelled. So what about if you're an animal, though, who's in one of those societies that really does look more like rule by bullies? It's the strict dominance hierarchies. Behavior is enforced basically through threat of violence. Can these political cultures change? And more generally, there's lots of evidence that animal cultures and societies change, whether in response to the environment or contact with external groups. On the question of political change, there's certainly suggestive evidence. So, for example, macaques who of the same species but who belong to different social groups will exhibit quite different political cultures. So some of those groups might be very rigidly hierarchical with quite strict dominance hierarchies. Others much more horizontal, pacific, cooperative. And the photo here is of all of baboons, and this is a famous case. The researcher Robert Sapolsky observed a group of olive baboons over many generations, and happened to, during this time, observe what happened when they were infected with tuberculosis, which killed the dominant males of the group, leaving the subordinate males and the females. And what happened after that was not that the subordinate males suddenly, moved up the ladder and took over the roles of those who had died from tuberculosis. Instead, what emerged was a much more cooperative and peaceful political culture, much more horizontal in how it made decisions. And moreover, that maintained over several generations. So as young male baboons came into this society as young adults, they were acculturated into this new way of being. And so it's not just that the baboons who survived the tuberculosis had the chance to experience a different political culture, but they actively reinforced and reproduced it through the socialization and culturation of newcomers to the group. So this is, I don't know how many examples there are of this kind of phenomenon, but it's very suggestive of, yeah, just the possibilities for quite dramatic political change in a group. And as for that, the last sort of piece of this is about the sense of community bonding, um, and um, and just and community affect, feelings of being part of a group. So here we have a photo on the left of the of a huddle of greater Ani. So these are from the cuckoo family, and they're cooperative breeders who form these long-term arrangements of 3 or 4 pairs who cooperatively nest and raise their young. And they come together in these little huddles multiple times per day for different reasons, like coordination of division of labor, for example. But one time they come together is after they've had a scary experience with a predator. So they've chased off a predator, they come back to their huddle, and it's thought that this is a way of seeking reassurance, right? So um, the group is, we're all okay, we're back together. And so in that case, it seems to be about a group feeling of security in each other's presence. But animals engage in many ways of sort of creating kinds of social glue, ways of having group affect, whether that's through coordinated physical movement, singing together, howling together, as the wolves on the right here are. Um, and most theorists of solidarity think that the possibility of group affect is quite central to that social glue. Okay, so I hope that's given you a taste anyway of what the kind of story we're telling about how animals are indeed engaged in normative politics. And I just want to pull out a little bit. So, why does this mean that we are, why does this compel us to recognize a right to politics, to self-rule and shared rule? And I just want to pull out a couple dimensions of this. So one concerns competence and well-being. So we've seen that animal societies have very complex skills and strategies and practices for achieving peace and coordination and cooperation. And in doing so, are able to ensure significant flourishing for their societies. And so it would be very strange to think that humans would be in a better position to govern their societies for them when we realize just how much they are actually doing to achieve what they achieve. We should recognize that their competence in doing so, and that gives us a reason, an important reason for respecting their right to self-government. Another dimension that we've sort of tried to pull out concerns freedom and agency. So again, all of this is not just something that happens to animals, and it's not something they're compelled to do. It's something they are actively doing together and reproducing and passing on through generations. And so we should be respecting their freedom and agency through a right to govern themselves. And as Will alluded to at the beginning, it's not just that normative politics presupposes some pro-social inclinations, orientation to group life, and so on. It is also the basis for the emergence of other and more morally valuable practices, right? So unless a society can achieve a reasonable amount of peace, stability, and cooperation, you're not going to see the emergence of caring and sharing and other normatively valuable practices. So we have sort of multiple related reasons for respecting animals' rights to self-government.
Okay, so just a couple more slides and then we'll be done. So Sue's given you the case for why we think animals have a right to politics. Now the question is what follows? What are the implications? And so basically the second half of the book is an attempt to spell out some of the implications. And we look at this both at a general level and then we drill down into some quite specific cases. So at the general level, if one agrees that animals have a right to politics, that means that wherever we see human-animal relations, one of the questions we should be asking is, what are the preconditions for animals to be able to engage in their forms of politics? So we call this the question of the holding environment. We should, like, what are the social and material conditions that enable animals to be political agents? And this holding environment, as Sue has just gone through, it's first and foremost it involves a set of social relationships and cultural practices. So for animals to be able to engage in politics, we need to respect, not intervene, not disrupt these social relations and cultural practices. But those in turn are often tied quite intimately with specific material conditions, specific habitats, environments, ecologies. And so these social worlds that animals live in are always emplaced, and we need to also not disrupt or destroy the material emplacement of their social relations and cultural practices. Sadly, humans historically have been massively destructive and disruptive of these holding environments. And we have such a bad track record that one might think that, at least in some cases, the best way to respect animals' right to politics is just for us to back off, to respectfully disengage. And indeed, we think that is a central conclusion to draw in relation to what we call truly wild animals, or animals who live in the wilderness, who try to avoid as much as possible humans and who are living on their own habitat away from humans. The best way to respect their right to politics is basically, indeed, to leave them and their lands alone. But in other contexts, perhaps in most contexts, humans and animals are entangled in such a way that that option of just letting them be is not feasible or desirable. And humans and animals are intertwined in such a way that we need to learn to do politics together. In some contexts, the nature of the entanglement is about our shared sociology. And this is particularly true in relation to domesticated animals. Domesticated animals, virtually by definition, are the animals who have been taken out of the wild and brought into our society. So their social world is now our social world, and vice versa. So we're socially entangled in a common social world, and we need to ask how domesticated animals can engage in co-authoring the social world that they share with us. In other cases, there may not be much by way of shared sociality, but we share the same physical space. So we think this is true often about what we call liminal animals. So these are animals who are not domesticated, they're wild in that sense, but they don't live out there on their own. They live here with us in our backyards, in our neighborhoods, in farming fields, and so on. And so even if they don't have any social relationship with us and may indeed avoid as much as possible social contact with us, we share the same physical space. And so we need to learn how to govern those shared physical spaces together. So in relation to both, wherever we have this dense social entanglement or dense geographical entanglement, we need to think about how to do politics together. And what we argue is that in these contexts, we should be on the lookout for the possibility that animals are in fact already trying to communicate with us. They are already making proposals to us about how to live together socially or how to live together geographically. And our obligation is to respond to their proposals as well as making our own proposals to them. So to try to think about forms of political communication and political negotiation such that we can then become the bearers of their political agents. We can be contributors rather than destroyers of their holding environment. Okay, so that's pretty abstract. So let me just give a couple of examples. So in the final 3 chapters of the book, we drill down into three kind of patterns, 3 possibilities, 3 possible trajectories for future relations with animals. So in chapter 8, we focus on the case of formerly domesticated animals, who, as I say, we should think of as sharing a social world with us. And the question is, how do we enable them to co-author that shared social world? And what we develop is an idea of what we call the animal agora, which is we try to think about the kinds of holding environments, again, literally both social and physical holding environments in which humans and formerly domesticated animals can learn about each other, learn about their identities and aspirations, respond to each other's proposals, and thereby co-author a world together. And we build up this model of the animal agora in part by thinking about the specific case of farmed animal sanctuaries, which we have done some work on in the past. That farmed animal sanctuaries are actually a fascinating test case because they bring in animals often from different species who have been rescued from exploitative factory farming. And now the question is, how do they want to live? Now that they've been liberated from the animal industrial complex, what kind of lives do they want to lead? This is a central question confronting sanctuaries. And in many sanctuaries, try to learn from animals themselves about what kind of physical spaces they want to engage in, what kind of social relationships with humans or without, with other species or without. Okay, so chapter 8 is on trying to elaborate this idea of animal agoras. In chapter 9, we look at the case of liminal animals who may not share sociality with us, but share the same physical space with us. And what we argue there is we should think of this shared physical space as what we call a multi-species commons. So these liminal animals who are not domesticated, again, they may not be part of our social world and may not have an active role to play in our schemes of social cooperation, but we should think of ourselves as sharing a physical commons with them, what we call the multi-species commons. And the question is, how can we engage in this process of communication and learning with the liminal animals who are what we call co-denizens? We should think of ourselves and liminal animals and domesticated animals as all denizens of this multi-species commons. How can we enable those liminal animals to exercise political agency in relation to this commons? And here again, we try to build up from experiments in urban co-design. So there's a lot of work being done in urban planning and urban design, trying to think about how one can design with urban wildlife. Stanislav Rudowski says that we should think about the animals living in cities as discerning clients of our planning activities. And so we make proposals to them and they are discerning clients, and we should be responsive to what they discern in our proposals, as well as listening to their own proposals. And then finally, in chapter 10, we take a look at the case of truly wild animals who live on their own habitats, who we think, as I said before, should be seen as having strong rights of self-government and territorial jurisdiction. We think of it as their territory, not ours. And therefore, our political relations with them could take the form of treaty federalism. So this idea of kind of treaty diplomacy with wild animals is an idea that has strong roots in some indigenous traditions in North America, and we draw on some of those traditions to think about our idea of treaty diplomacy. So we think of ourselves as having treaty relationships with wild animal nations. But we also try to show that this idea can draw upon, but can also strengthen some emerging practices in conservation biology and in the rights of nature. So in both cases, what we try to show is that these are movements, both conservation and rights of nature, are movements that have the aspiration to protect wild animals. And we try to show that their own ideas about how to protect wild animals would be much stronger if they explicitly built into their ideas the idea that wild animals have a right to politics. Okay, so obviously that's still pretty abstract, but hopefully that gives you an idea of what we're trying to do in the last third of the book in those final three chapters. But just to sum up, given the variety in the ways in which animals, the various kinds of sociality that animals have, the variety in their cultural practices, and the diversity of their relationships with humans, there's clearly not going to just be one model of a right to politics, not just one model of an interspecies politics. And in particular, we're not defenders of the idea of a cosmozoopolis, that we all should be seen as equal individual citizens of some global interspecies democracy. Rather, we think the best way to respect a right to politics is to recognize that there are multiple demoi, multiple political communities operating at different scales, some of which animals are going to live separately from us, some of which we share with animals. They're going to have overlapping boundaries and divided jurisdictions, which is why we're interested in the idea of federalism as a way of thinking in the future. So it's going to be a complicated story, no one model. We need to be attentive to the specificity of animal sociality and culture and the specificity of their relationships with humans. And there's still a lot to learn on those fronts. So in these final chapters, we're not offering a kind of final blueprint about what the final destination is. In fact, that would contradict the whole premise, because the point of the book is that we don't know where to move until we engage with animals themselves. And so what we're trying to do in these final three chapters is to ask, what are the first steps? What are the preconditions for us to be able to engage in this process of co-authoring with animals, such that animals themselves help to determine what those future directions are? But on our view, the first step is indeed to respect a right to politics. Okay, that's a short summary. I hope that's helpful. Thank you very much.